Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Dogwood Ridge. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1910, and Dogwood Ridge was nothing more than a forgotten stretch of rural America nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Sparse settlements dotted the landscape, connected by dirt roads that turned to mud with the slightest rain. The Blackburn family had lived there for 3 generations, their farmhouse standing as a silent witness to the changing seasons and unchanging human nature. What happened within those walls would remain buried for decades, a testament to how effectively silence can preserve the darkest of secrets. March the 17th, 1910. That was the date recorded in the county registry when Thomas Blackburn reported the disappearance of his wife, Eleanor. According to the yellowed report filed at the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Office, Thomas claimed Eleanor had gone to visit her sister in Millfield, some 30 miles east. The report notes that Thomas appeared appropriately concerned and that neighbors confirmed Eleanor had mentioned such plans the previous Sunday after church services. What makes this case particularly unsettling isn't what the records show, but what they don't. Eleanor Blackburn never arrived at her sister's home. This fact, curiously, wasn't discovered until weeks later, when her sister Martha finally sent a letter to the Blackburn residence inquiring about Eleanor's continued absence. By then, Thomas Blackburn had already returned to his normal routines. The community had already accepted his explanation. According to the sparse documentation that survived from that period, no formal investigation was ever launched. The sheriff noted in his log that Thomas provided a letter, supposedly from Eleanor, stating she had decided to extend her stay with her sister indefinitely. The handwriting was never verified. The case was closed before it truly began. These are the facts as they were known in 1910. But facts, as we've learned, are merely the visible portion of truth's iceberg. What lies beneath took nearly 5 decades to surface. In Dogwood Ridge, some stories aren't meant to be told. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. This is one such story, a narrative pieced together from county records, personal diaries, newspaper clippings, and the reluctant testimonies of those who still remembered. This is the story of the Blackburn family, their tragic legacy, and the darkness that consumed them all. Thomas Blackburn was what locals called good stock. The son of a successful farmer, he had inherited not only land, but respect in the community. By all accounts, he was a man of few words, but reliable character. He attended church services at the white clapboard chapel that still stands on Miller's Hill. He paid his debts on time. He nodded politely to passers-by on his infrequent trips into town. The Blackburn farm produced modest but consistent crops, and Thomas was known to help neighbors during difficult harvests. Eleanor Blackburn, née Sutton, was described in a 1907 article in the Oak Ridge County Chronicle as a woman of gentle disposition and considerable artistic talent. The article, covering a small exhibition of local handicrafts, mentioned Eleanor's intricate needlework, noting that she had won a regional prize for her detailed tapestries depicting local landscapes. The newspaper described her as soft-spoken yet thoughtful, someone who observes more than she says. The Blackburns had married in 1896, a union that merged 2 well-established local families. They lived in the original Blackburn homestead, a 2-story farmhouse set back from the main road, partially hidden by a stand of ancient oak trees. The property included nearly 80 acres of farmland, a barn, and several outbuildings. A small creek ran along the eastern edge of their property, eventually feeding into the broader Carson River some miles south. Local tax records show that the Blackburn property was valued above average for the region, suggesting relative prosperity. Church donation records indicate regular, if modest, contributions to the local parish and occasional charity toward widows and orphans in the community. On the surface, the Blackburns represented the steady, unremarkable backbone of rural American life. Yet beneath this placid exterior, something wasn't right. The first indication comes from the diary of Margaret Wilson, the midwife who served Dogwood Ridge and surrounding communities for nearly 40 years. In an entry dated September 3, 1903, she wrote, "Called to the Blackburn home for the third time this year. Eleanor's condition unchanged. Thomas declined further visits, stating they would manage on their own henceforth. There is a stillness in that house that troubles me deeply." What condition Margaret referred to was never explicitly stated, but other entries suggest Eleanor suffered from recurring episodes of what was then commonly called nervous exhaustion. More telling, perhaps, is what isn't in the records. Despite being married for 14 years, the Blackburns remained childless. In an era and community where large families were the norm, this absence stood out, though it was rarely discussed openly. Reverend James Holbrook, who served as pastor in Dogwood Ridge from 1898 until 1915, kept meticulous notes about his parish visits. His leather-bound journals, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, contain this curious entry from December 1908. "Called upon the Blackburn household today. Thomas received me on the porch and declined my entry, citing Eleanor's fatigue. When pressed about their absence from services, he assured me they maintained their devotions privately. I departed unsatisfied, with the distinct impression of being unwelcome. Something in Thomas's gaze has changed since I first knew him." These fragmentary insights might have remained just that, curious but inconclusive glimpses into a private marriage, if not for what happened in the spring of 1910 and the chain of discoveries that would follow decades later. The morning of March 15, 1910, dawned with the promise of spring. According to weather records from the Regional Almanac, the temperature reached an unseasonable 68 degrees by midday. Several accounts mention how the dogwood trees that gave the ridge its name were beginning to bloom early that year. That morning, Eleanor Blackburn was seen by at least 3 neighbors. Martha Jenkins encountered her at Holloway's General Store, where Eleanor was purchasing sewing supplies. In her later statement to the Oak Ridge Historical Society in 1963, Martha recalled, "She seemed in good spirits. We discussed the early spring, and she mentioned she was working on a new tapestry featuring the dogwood blooms. She purchased several spools of thread, including an unusual shade of red that Mr. Holloway had just received from his supplier in Cincinnati." Later that same morning, Eleanor spoke briefly with Reverend Holbrook outside the post office. His journal entry notes, "Mrs. Blackburn appeared well, though perhaps thinner than when last I saw her some months ago. She inquired after my wife's health and promised they would attend Easter services. Her smile, I noted, did not reach her eyes." The final confirmed sighting came from Daniel Cooper, who owned the property adjacent to the Blackburns. He reported seeing Eleanor hanging laundry in the yard around noon. Nothing in her demeanor suggested distress or unusual circumstances. 2 days later, Thomas Blackburn would report her missing. What happened in those intervening 48 hours has been the subject of speculation for over half a century. The official account, as accepted in 1910, was straightforward. Eleanor had departed for her sister's home in Millfield, taking the tri-weekly stagecoach that passed through Dogwood Ridge on Wednesday mornings. Yet no passenger on that coach recalled seeing Eleanor Blackburn. The driver, Samuel Whitaker, kept a manifest of passengers and parcels. Eleanor's name does not appear on the list for March 16th or any subsequent date that month. This discrepancy, however, wasn't discovered during the initial perfunctory inquiry into her disappearance. The community's acceptance of Thomas's explanation reveals much about the era. Women were still largely defined by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, or sisters. Eleanor's decision to visit her sister, perhaps even to stay with her for an extended period, would not have seemed unusual enough to warrant scrutiny. That the visit was unplanned, that no one had seen her pack or depart, that she had mentioned no such intentions to anyone she encountered on March 15th. These details were overlooked in 1910. Life in Dogwood Ridge continued. The dogwood trees bloomed fully and then shed their petals. Spring planting began. Thomas Blackburn was seen working his fields, attending to his livestock, making his monthly trip to the bank in the county seat. If neighbors thought it strange that he showed little apparent distress over his wife's extended absence, they kept such thoughts to themselves. By June, Eleanor's disappearance had ceased to be a topic of conversation. The community had accepted what they were told, or perhaps what they wished to believe. Eleanor had gone away. She would return when she was ready, or perhaps she wouldn't. Such things happened, even in places like Dogwood Ridge. But silence is rarely a permanent state. It merely postpones the inevitable emergence of truth. The Blackburn farmhouse stood 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, at the end of a long, dirt drive lined with ancient oak trees. The approach created a sense of increasing isolation, as though one were leaving the known world behind with each step. The house itself was substantial but not ostentatious, a 2-story structure built in the 1860s by Thomas's grandfather. Its white clapboard exterior had weathered to a pale gray, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly on the northern corner. Inside, according to those few who visited in the years before Eleanor's disappearance, the home was maintained with rigid precision. Mary Holloway, wife of the general store owner, noted in a church lady's auxiliary record from 1908, "Mrs. Blackburn keeps a most orderly home, with everything in its proper place. One almost hesitates to sit, for fear of disturbing the perfect arrangement. The parlor contains several fine pieces of furniture and a remarkable grandfather clock that Mr. Blackburn's father brought from Philadelphia." This outward order, however, masked tensions that occasionally surfaced. Sarah Cooper, wife of the neighboring farmer, recalled decades later, "You could feel it when you entered, like the air before a storm. They were always proper, always polite, but there was something strained between them. Eleanor would sometimes start to speak, and Thomas would give her a certain look, just a look, and she would fall silent mid-sentence." The daily rhythm of the Blackburn household followed the predictable pattern of rural life. Thomas rose before dawn to tend to the livestock and fields. Eleanor managed the household, preserved foods, maintained the kitchen garden, and worked on her needlework. They took their meals together in formal silence. In the evenings, Thomas would often retire to his study, where he kept the farm accounts and occasionally read from his modest library of agricultural texts and classical literature. What makes the Blackburn case so unsettling is how utterly conventional their life appeared on the surface. There were no reported instances of public discord, no rumors of infidelity or financial trouble, no obvious motive for the tragedy that would unfold. This very normalcy would later confound investigators and historians alike. Yet there were subtle indications that all was not well. Eleanor had stopped attending social gatherings in the year before her disappearance, citing increasingly frequent headaches and fatigue. Her once regular correspondence with her sister in Millfield had become sporadic. The vibrant scenes depicted in her early needlework had given way to abstract patterns, dominated by dark blues and purples. According to Josephine Reed, who occasionally assisted with laundry at the Blackburn home, Eleanor had grown noticeably thinner in the months leading up to March 1910. Her dresses hung loose where once they fit proper, Josephine noted in a statement recorded in 1962, and there was a tremor in her hand sometimes when she thought no one was looking. Thomas, meanwhile, had developed a reputation for increasing rigidity and isolation. Where once he had participated, however minimally, in community affairs, by 1909 he rarely engaged with neighbors beyond what was necessary for business matters. Several accounts mention his growing preoccupation with the property boundaries, personally walking the perimeter each Sunday after church services. A particularly telling incident occurred in January 1910, just 2 months before Eleanor's disappearance. Jacob Henderson, whose farm lay to the west of the Blackburn property, encountered Thomas reinforcing a fence line well after sunset. According to Henderson's account, preserved in a letter to his son, I called out a greeting, thinking he would welcome the company in such bitter cold. Instead, he stared at me as though I were trespassing on sacred ground. "This is Blackburn land," he said, though I had made no move to cross the boundary. "What happens here is Blackburn business." I left him to his work, but the encounter troubled me for days after. What was Thomas Blackburn so determined to keep out, or perhaps to keep in? The answer would begin to emerge on a stormy night in April 1910, just weeks after Eleanor's reported departure. The evening of April 7, 1910, brought an unseasonable thunderstorm to Dogwood Ridge. Lightning split the sky, and rain fell in sheets heavy enough to wash out portions of the main road. Most residents stayed safely indoors, but one man ventured out into the deluge. Edward Collins, a drifter who had been doing odd jobs around the community, was seeking shelter when he came upon the Blackburn barn. According to his account, recorded years later during a stay at the Oak Ridge County Sanitarium, he entered the structure without permission, desperate to escape the worsening storm. "I hadn't intended to snoop," Collins stated in the sanitarium records. "Just needed somewhere dry to wait out the rain. That's when I heard it, scratching, like something trying to get out. Came from beneath the floorboards in the back corner of the barn. I thought maybe a raccoon or possum had gotten trapped. Being handy and hoping to earn some goodwill, I pried up one of the loose boards to have a look. What Collins discovered wasn't an animal. Instead, he found a small space beneath the floor containing what he described as a woman's personal effects. According to his account, there was a leather-bound journal, several hair combs, a silver hand mirror, and a partially completed piece of needlework. The strangest thing, Collins recalled, was that they were arranged almost like an altar, purposeful-like, and there was writing scratched into one of the support beams. Just one word: Eleanor. Before Collins could investigate further, Thomas Blackburn allegedly appeared in the barn doorway. What followed, if Collins's account is to be believed, was a confrontation that ended with Thomas threatening the drifter with a shotgun and ordering him off the property. Collins claimed he fled immediately, not stopping until he reached the next county. Fear kept him from reporting what he had found. It wasn't until 1947, when Collins was institutionalized following what doctors termed a nervous breakdown, that he finally shared his story. For decades, Collins's account was dismissed as the delusion of a troubled mind. Yet certain details, the specific description of items known to belong to Eleanor, the precise location within the barn, would later prove difficult to explain away as mere fabrication. The night of the storm marked the beginning of a subtle shift in Thomas Blackburn's behavior. Several accounts note that he became even more reclusive afterward. He hired 2 men from the next county to help with the planting that spring, rather than employing local workers as he had in previous years. He built a new padlock for the barn, one that Robert Holloway, who supplied the hardware, described as excessive for keeping out ordinary thieves. Most notably, Thomas began to decline all visitors to the property. When Reverend Holbrook attempted a pastoral call in late April, Thomas met him at the edge of the drive and spoke with him there, never inviting him onto the property. The Reverend's journal entry expresses concern. Mr. Blackburn appears haggard and unwashed. When I inquired after news from Mrs. Blackburn, he became agitated, stating only that she is where she belongs, before asking me to leave. Throughout the summer of 1910, Thomas maintained his farm operations, but withdrew further from community life. He no longer attended church services. He sent one of his hired men to conduct business in town. The only time he was seen regularly was during his monthly visit to the bank, where he would deposit farm income and withdraw only what was necessary for operating expenses. By autumn, rumors had begun to circulate. Some suggested Eleanor had not gone to her sister at all, but had run off with another man. Others speculated that she had suffered a mental collapse and been committed to an asylum, a fate that carried such stigma that Thomas would naturally want to conceal it. A few even suggested she had died, perhaps by her own hand, and that Thomas had fabricated her departure to avoid scandal. None suspected the truth that would eventually come to light, a truth far more disturbing than their darkest speculations. The changing of seasons brings a particular melancholy to places like Dogwood Ridge. As summer gave way to autumn in 1910, the forests surrounding the Blackburn property exploded in russets and golds before surrendering to winter's approaching barrenness. The house seemed to withdraw further into itself, windows reflecting the gray sky like vacant eyes. Thomas Blackburn continued his diminished existence, moving between house, barn, and fields with mechanical precision. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the farmhouse at unusual hours, a lamp moving from room to room well past midnight, as though someone were searching for something lost. The hired men spoke of strange noises from the locked barn, which Thomas explained as settling timbers or wild animals seeking shelter. One of these workers, Joseph Miller, would later tell investigators, "Mr. Blackburn had strict rules. We weren't to go near the house or the barn unless specifically instructed. Once I needed a tool I knew was stored in the barn. Rather than retrieve it himself, Mr. Blackburn sent me all the way back to town to purchase a new one. It struck me as wasteful and odd." In November 1910, nearly 8 months after Eleanor's reported departure, her sister Martha finally traveled to Dogwood Ridge seeking answers. According to the account she gave to the County Historical Society in 1959, she had written multiple letters without receiving reply. Concerned and frustrated, she made the journey from Millfield only to find the Blackburn property seemingly abandoned. "The gate was chained shut," Martha recalled. "I called out for Thomas, for anyone, but received no response. Through the trees I could see smoke rising from the chimney, so someone was there. I waited for nearly 3 hours, but no one emerged." As the day grew late and a chill set in, I had no choice but to return to town. Martha sought assistance from Sheriff William Patterson, who reluctantly agreed to accompany her to the property the following day. The sheriff's log contains a terse entry. Responded to concern regarding T. Blackburn residence. Subject eventually answered door, appeared unwell, but in no immediate distress. Refused to discuss wife's whereabouts beyond stating she had gone west for her health. No evidence of criminal activity observed. Advised complainant, Martha Sutton, that adults are free to travel as they wish. What the official record doesn't mention is Martha's observation, shared years later, that Thomas was wearing what appeared to be one of Eleanor's shawls around his shoulders when he finally came to the door. Nor does it note that Martha spotted her sister's distinctive silver hairbrush on a table visible through the doorway, an item Eleanor surely would have taken if traveling for an extended period. Martha returned to Millfield troubled and unconvinced, but without any concrete evidence of wrongdoing. She would continue to write letters to local authorities over the following years, letters that were largely dismissed and eventually lost in the administrative shuffling of county records. As 1910 drew to a close, Dogwood Ridge settled into an uneasy acceptance of Eleanor Blackburn's absence. Thomas became a subject of pity rather than suspicion, a man abandoned by his wife, soldiering on alone. The community's collective memory began its gradual revision, with some even recalling signs of Eleanor's discontent that had never been mentioned at the time. The Blackburn farm continued to operate, though on a reduced scale. Thomas sold off a portion of the livestock and left some fields fallow. The hired men were dismissed as winter set in, leaving Thomas truly alone on the property. Or was he? Reports from that winter include curious details. Daniel Cooper, whose property adjoined the Blackburns, claimed to have heard a woman's voice calling from the direction of the farmhouse late one December night. It was too far to make out words, he later stated, but the sound was distinctly female, high-pitched, and distressed. Given the hour and the snow on the ground, I convinced myself it must have been a screech owl or some other night creature. Reverend Holbrook made one final attempt to visit Thomas before Christmas, bringing a basket of food prepared by the Church Ladies' Auxiliary. His journal records found Mr. Blackburn greatly changed, gaunt and gray, with an unsettling intensity in his gaze. He accepted the basket but refused all invitations to services or social gatherings. Most disturbingly, I observed what appeared to be a woman's dress laid out on the parlor sofa, visible through the window. When I inquired, Mr. Blackburn pulled the curtains closed and bid me good day with unmistakable finality. The winter of 1910-1911 was unusually harsh. Snow isolated the more remote properties for weeks at a time. The Blackburn farmhouse, already withdrawn from community life, disappeared completely under winter's white shroud. What transpired there during those long, dark months would remain hidden for decades, preserved only in the deteriorating mind of Thomas Blackburn and the silent witness of the house itself. It would be spring before anyone from Dogwood Ridge saw Thomas again. When he finally reappeared, emerging from his long isolation to purchase supplies in town, those who encountered him were struck by his transformation. Once a robust, imposing figure, he had become almost skeletal, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His once trimmed beard had grown wild, streaked with white despite his relatively young age of 42. Most unsettling were his eyes, described by multiple sources as feverish, and looking through rather than at people. Thomas spoke little during these infrequent visits to town, conducting his business with minimal interaction. He purchased unusual quantities of certain items, candles, kerosene, salt, and fabric for a man with no apparent need for such things. When questioned, even casually, about his wife, he would abruptly end conversations and depart. As 1911 progressed, Thomas's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was observed talking to himself while walking the boundaries of his property. He began posting no trespassing signs at regular intervals along the perimeter. On one occasion, he was seen digging in the field near the creek at night by the light of a lantern. Robert Holloway, whose general store supplied most of Dogwood Ridge, noted in his business ledger, "T. Blackburn account increasingly irregular. Purchases items, then returns them unused. Requested 6 pairs of women's gloves today, became agitated when styles didn't match something he had in mind. Settled for 2 pairs, but seemed deeply dissatisfied. Suspect his solitude has affected his faculties." By the harvest of 1911, much of the Blackburn farmland lay untended, the orchards were unpruned, the fields overgrown. Thomas focused his diminishing energy on the house and barn, maintaining them with obsessive attention while allowing the rest of the property to decline. In October 1911, a significant development occurred that might have altered the course of events. A letter arrived from California addressed to Eleanor Blackburn. The postmaster, following standard procedure, delivered it to the Blackburn residence. Thomas accepted the letter without comment. 3 days later, Thomas appeared at the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Office. According to the official report, he requested that the sheriff issue a formal declaration regarding Eleanor. The document, preserved in county records, states only that Eleanor Sutton Blackburn, having departed from her marital home in March 1910 and having provided no direct communication since that time, is hereby officially recognized as absent. This curious document, neither a missing person report nor a death certificate, served no clear legal purpose. Yet Thomas insisted upon it, even paying a fee for its official filing. What prompted this sudden desire for formal acknowledgement of Eleanor's absence? The answer may lie in the letter from California, the contents of which remained unknown until 1963, when a collection of correspondence was discovered during the renovation of the Oak Ridge Post Office. Among the undelivered items was a carbon copy that the postmaster had made of this particular letter, a practice occasionally followed with unusual or potentially important communications. The letter was from the administration of a women's college in San Francisco, responding to an inquiry about teaching positions. It referenced previous correspondence from Eleanor Blackburn and expressed interest in her qualifications, particularly her artistic skills. The college requested references and suggested potential employment beginning with the spring term of 1912. Had Eleanor been planning an escape? Was the story of visiting her sister merely a cover for a more permanent departure? The letter suggests she had been considering a new life, one that would take her far from Dogwood Ridge and Thomas Blackburn. If Thomas intercepted this letter, and the evidence strongly suggests he did, it would have confirmed his wife had been planning to leave him. For a man already showing signs of mental instability, this revelation might have been the catalyst for what followed. November 23rd, 1911. The date stands out in the chronicles of Dogwood Ridge, marked by an event that would alter the community's understanding of the Blackburn case, though its full significance wouldn't be realized for many years. Shortly after midnight, Daniel Cooper was awakened by what he described as an unholy light coming from the direction of the Blackburn property. Looking out his bedroom window, he saw flames rising above the tree line. The Blackburn barn was burning. By the time Cooper and other neighbors arrived at the property, the structure was fully engulfed. Thomas Blackburn stood in the yard, making no effort to combat the flames. According to multiple witnesses, he watched the fire with an expression of eerie calm, almost satisfaction. When Sheriff Patterson arrived, Thomas claimed the fire had been started by a lantern knocked over during a windstorm. This explanation was accepted, despite the night being notably still and clear. No formal investigation was conducted. The barn burned to its foundation, leaving nothing but ash and twisted metal. What burned with it? This question would haunt later investigators. Edward Collins's account of finding Eleanor's possessions hidden beneath the floorboards suggested the barn contained evidence related to her disappearance. Had Thomas deliberately destroyed this evidence? Or was there something else in that barn, something that needed to be consumed by fire? In the days following the fire, Thomas's behavior took another disturbing turn. He began making improvements to the house, repainting the exterior, replacing broken windows, ordering new furniture from the catalog at Holloway's store. Most notably, he hired a stonemason from the county seat to construct a root cellar beneath the kitchen, an unusual project to undertake at the beginning of winter when most such work was done in early fall before the harvest. The stonemason, Patrick Donnelly, later recalled, "It was odd work all around. Mr. Blackburn insisted on unusual specifications, the walls thicker than necessary, the floor laid with a slope toward a central drain, the entrance sealed with an iron door he had custom ordered from Cincinnati. When I questioned the practicality of certain elements, he simply increased my fee. I completed the work as requested, though I confess it left me uneasy." Throughout the winter of 1911-1912, Thomas continued his renovation efforts with manic energy. He seemed possessed by the need to transform the property, as though preparing it for some important event or visitor. Yet he remained as isolated as ever, refusing all social invitations and restricting his interactions to necessary business transactions. By spring, the Blackburn house had taken on a strange duality, the exterior freshly painted and maintained, the surrounding property overgrown and neglected. Thomas himself reflected this contradiction, appearing in town in clean pressed clothing while his physical health continued to deteriorate. His weight loss became more pronounced, and several accounts mention a persistent cough that he made little effort to conceal. In April 1912, just over 2 years after Eleanor's disappearance, Thomas posted a notice in the Oak Ridge County Chronicle. The brief announcement stated, "T. Blackburn of Dogwood Ridge hereby acknowledges the permanent absence of Eleanor Sutton Blackburn and relinquishes all claims to her return." This peculiar public statement, neither a divorce filing nor a death notice, prompted renewed speculation throughout the community. The most significant reaction came from Martha Sutton, Eleanor's sister, who immediately traveled to Oak Ridge County upon seeing the notice. She attempted once more to speak with Thomas, this time bringing with her an attorney from Millfield. According to court records, they sought a formal inquiry into Eleanor's whereabouts, presenting the letter from the Women's College in California as evidence that she had been planning a legitimate departure rather than an abandonment of her marriage. Sheriff Patterson, nearing retirement, and, reluctant to pursue what he viewed as a domestic matter, conducted a perfunctory investigation. He interviewed Thomas at the county courthouse, neutral ground that Thomas had insisted upon, and accepted his claim that Eleanor had sent a letter from Denver, Colorado, expressing her intention never to return to Dogwood Ridge or to her marriage. When pressed to produce this letter, Thomas claimed it had been lost in the barn fire. When asked why he hadn't mentioned this crucial communication previously, he reportedly replied, "A man has a right to hope his wife might change her mind. I've now abandoned that hope." Martha's attorney filed a petition for a more thorough investigation, but the matter stalled in the county court system. The judge, citing insufficient evidence of foul play and the absence of any crime beyond marital desertion, which was not itself illegal, declined to pursue the case further. Martha returned to Millfield defeated but not convinced. She would continue her private inquiries for years, writing to authorities in Denver and other western cities, seeking any trace of her sister. No record of Eleanor Blackburn, or anyone matching her description using another name, was ever found. As for Thomas, the posting of the notice seemed to provide some form of closure. His frenetic renovation efforts ceased. He settled into a quieter, though still isolated, existence. The newly renovated house became, in effect, a shrine, maintained with obsessive precision despite being occupied by just one increasingly frail man. Those few who had business dealings with Thomas during this period described a man who had reached an unsettling equilibrium, functioning in practical matters while exhibiting clear signs of mental disturbance. He began referring to Eleanor in the present tense again, making comments such as, "Eleanor prefers the curtains open during the day," or "Eleanor finds that too bitter," when declining offered food or drink. By the winter of 1912-1913, the Blackburn case had faded from active concern in Dogwood Ridge. Eleanor was presumed gone, Thomas was viewed as an eccentric recluse, and the community had more immediate matters to occupy its attention. The mystery might have remained buried indefinitely if not for a chance discovery in the spring of 1913, a discovery that would cast the previous 3 years in a disturbing new light. On May 18, 1913, heavy rains caused significant flooding throughout Oak Ridge County. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Blackburn property overflowed its banks, washing away soil and debris from the surrounding area. As the waters receded, a survey team assessing flood damage made a grim discovery: partial human remains exposed by the erosion of the bank. Sheriff Patterson, in one of his final acts before retirement, responded to the scene. The remains, a portion of a human arm with some attached tissue, were collected and examined by Dr. Harold Wilson, the county physician. His report, preserved in the county medical records, states, "Remains appear to be from adult human, likely female based on size and proportion. Tissue shows signs of chemical preservation rather than natural decomposition. Impossible to determine cause of death or identity from fragments available." A search of the surrounding area yielded no additional remains. When questioned, Thomas Blackburn denied any knowledge of the matter and refused to allow a search of his property without a warrant. The retiring sheriff, perhaps unwilling to embroil himself in a complicated case so close to his departure, did not pursue such a warrant. The remains were eventually buried in the county cemetery in an unmarked grave. The incident caused a brief revival of speculation regarding Eleanor's fate, but without conclusive evidence connecting the remains to her disappearance, the matter once again subsided. Thomas's increasingly reclusive behavior was now attributed to the stigma of these suspicions rather than to any actual guilt. The truth of what happened at the Blackburn farm would remain hidden for decades, preserved only in the deteriorating mind of Thomas Blackburn and in the physical evidence that would eventually come to light. Thomas lived on at the property until 1918, when his declining health finally forced him to seek assistance. By then, he was suffering from what was likely tuberculosis, though no formal diagnosis was recorded. Unable to maintain even basic self-care, he was taken in by the county hospital in February of that year. During his 5-month stay at the facility, Thomas reportedly spoke often of Eleanor, sometimes as though she were present in the room, other times as though she were waiting for him at home. The hospital chaplain, Reverend Michael Collins, no relation to the drifter Edward Collins, documented these conversations in his visitation log. Mr. Blackburn expresses concern that Eleanor is alone too much and that he must return to keep her company. When gently reminded of her long absence, he becomes agitated, insisting she never left. She couldn't leave. The house wouldn't let her. As his condition worsened, Thomas's comments became more disturbing. A night nurse recorded him saying, "I kept her close, where she belongs, not beneath us, no, that would be wrong. Within the walls, that's where she stays. Part of the house now. Always watching." Thomas Blackburn died on July 12, 1918, without making any clear confession or providing definitive information about Eleanor's fate. He was buried in the church cemetery in Dogwood Ridge, his funeral attended by only a handful of community members out of respect for his family's long standing in the area rather than for the man himself. The Blackburn property, having no direct heirs, passed to a distant cousin who lived in Ohio. This relative, having no interest in relocating, placed the property on the market. It remained unsold for nearly a decade, its reputation and remote location deterring potential buyers despite the relatively low asking price. In 1927, the house and remaining land were finally purchased by William and Catherine Marshall, a young couple from Pennsylvania seeking affordable farmland. Unaware of the property's history, they moved in with plans to restore the farm to productivity. The Marshalls' tenure at the former Blackburn property was brief and traumatic. Within 6 months, they abandoned the house, forfeiting their investment. County records show they sold the land, but not the house, to a neighboring farmer at a substantial loss. Catherine Marshall's journal, discovered among her effects after her death in 1962, provides a chilling account of their time in the house. The disturbances began almost immediately. Items moved between rooms without explanation. Doors that were securely latched would stand open in the morning. The temperature in the main parlor remains inexplicably cold, regardless of how we stoke the fire. More disturbing were the sounds Catherine documented. The walls contain a presence. We hear it moving within them, particularly at night. A slow, dragging sound that follows a precise pattern through the house. William has torn open sections of wall, finding nothing but normal construction. Yet the sounds continue, more insistent after each investigation, as though angered by our intrusion. The final entry, dated March 3, 1928, reads simply, "Found the lock of hair woven into the new curtains I hung yesterday, hair that matches none in this household. We leave tomorrow, abandoning whatever possessions cannot be packed by sunrise." The house remained vacant after the Marshalls' departure. Over the following decades, various owners would purchase the land, but the house itself was left to deteriorate, surrounded by actively farmed fields, but itself untouched. Local legends began to circulate about the property, and it became known as the Haunted Blackburn Place among the residents of Oak Ridge County. The property passed through several owners, none of whom attempted to inhabit or even maintain the house. By the late 1950s, it had fallen into advanced decay, its roof partially collapsed, its windows broken, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. In 1963, the land was purchased by a development company with plans to clear the old structures and divide the property into smaller residential lots. The deteriorated condition of the Blackburn house necessitated complete demolition rather than renovation. It was during this process that the final chapter of Eleanor Blackburn's story would be revealed. On September 17, 1963, the demolition crew made a disturbing discovery within the walls of the master bedroom. As they tore down the lath and plaster, workers uncovered a space between the inner and outer walls, a space that contained human remains. The county coroner, Dr. James Harrison, was called to the scene. His official report describes finding the skeletal remains of an adult human, likely female, embedded within the wall structure of the building. The remains show evidence of having been preserved or treated with chemicals prior to being sealed within the wall. Several personal effects were found with the remains, including a silver hairbrush, a wedding ring engraved with the initials ES to TB, 1896, and fragments of what appears to be needlework. Forensic techniques in 1963 were limited compared to modern methods, but Dr. Harrison's examination suggested the remains had been placed in the wall around 1910-1915, consistent with the timeline of Eleanor's disappearance. More disturbing was his conclusion that the body appears to have been preserved using techniques similar to those employed by morticians, suggesting knowledge of embalming procedures or access to relevant chemicals. This discovery prompted a formal investigation, leading to the collection of historical records and testimonies that form much of the basis for this account. Martha Sutton, by then in her 80s, was finally vindicated in her long-held suspicion that her sister had never left Dogwood Ridge alive. As investigators pieced together the case, a disturbing hypothesis emerged. It appeared that Thomas Blackburn had killed Eleanor, whether deliberately or accidentally remains unknown, and then preserved her body using chemicals he could have obtained through agricultural supply channels. Rather than burying her, he had instead sealed her within the walls of their home during his frenzied renovation period of 1911-1912. The partial remains found in the creek in 1913 were likely fragments that Thomas had been attempting to dispose of separately, perhaps tissues that couldn't be preserved or that would have created noticeable odors within the house. The root cellar that Thomas had commissioned, with its unusual specifications, now appeared to have been a workspace for his grisly project rather than for food storage. Patrick Donnelly, the stonemason who constructed it, was still alive in 1963 and confirmed that the drain he had installed at Thomas's insistence would have been suitable for washing away fluids during an embalming process. What drove Thomas to such extremes? The investigation uncovered the letter from the Women's College in California, suggesting that Eleanor had indeed been planning to leave her husband. Various testimonies painted a picture of a controlling man who had grown increasingly possessive and paranoid. In his distorted mind, preserving Eleanor's physical form within the house may have represented a way of ensuring she could never truly leave him. A particularly disturbing discovery came from a metal box found within the wall cavity alongside Eleanor's remains. Inside was a journal, apparently kept by Thomas in the months following her disappearance. Most entries were mundane records of farm operations, but interspersed were passages of a more troubling nature. One, dated April 30th, 1910, reads, "She speaks to me still through the walls. Her voice comes clearest at twilight. She understands now why I could not let her go to California. A wife's place is in her home, forever in her home." Another entry from February 1912, during the renovation period, states simply, "The work is complete. Eleanor is where she belongs now, part of the house itself. She will never leave again. We are one with these walls." Dr. Richard Sanderson, a psychiatrist who reviewed the journal for the investigation, suggested that Thomas had likely experienced a psychotic break, perhaps triggered by Eleanor's plans to leave. The entries indicate a man who could no longer distinguish between possessing a person and possessing an object, Sanderson noted in his report. In his deteriorated mental state, preserving Eleanor's physical form within the house represented a twisted form of preservation of the marriage itself. The full contents of Thomas's journal were never made public, sealed by court order at the request of the few remaining Blackburn and Sutton relatives. What has emerged from those who reviewed the document suggests a gradual descent into delusion, with Thomas increasingly convinced that Eleanor's spirit remained in the house, communicating with him through the walls that contained her physical remains. The human remains discovered in the Blackburn house were finally laid to rest in the Oak Ridge County Cemetery on October 23, 1963. more than 50 years after Eleanor's disappearance. Martha Sutton, at 87, traveled from Millfield to attend the service. The headstone, which still stands today, bears the inscription, Eleanor Sutton Blackburn, 1874-1910, finally at rest. The Blackburn case was officially closed in 1963, the mystery solved too late for any justice to be served. Thomas Blackburn, the only person who knew the complete truth of what had transpired, had taken most of his secrets to the grave decades earlier. The development company, understandably troubled by the discoveries, abandoned their plans for the property. The land was eventually donated to the county and designated as a natural preserve. The foundation of the Blackburn house was removed, and the area was allowed to return to forest. Today, only a small historical marker acknowledges what once stood there. Yet the story of the Blackburns continues to resonate through Dogwood Ridge. Local lore holds that on certain spring nights when the dogwood trees are in bloom, the sound of a woman's muffled cries can be heard in the woods where the house once stood. Whether this is the power of suggestion or something more is left to individual interpretation. What makes the Blackburn case so disturbing is not just the horror of Eleanor's fate, but the revelation of how effectively silence and social convention can conceal tragedy. The community of Dogwood Ridge, with its reluctance to intrude on private matters and its deference to a respected family name, had unwittingly enabled Thomas's actions. The proper appearances the Blackburns maintained had created a shield behind which darkness could flourish undetected. In the years since the case was solved, historians and psychologists have studied it as an example of how rural isolation and rigid social structures can create environments where domestic violence can escalate to extreme ends without intervention. The case has been cited in academic papers on the evolution of law enforcement approaches to missing persons and domestic abuse. For the people of Dogwood Ridge and surrounding communities, the Blackburn case serves as a somber reminder that sometimes the most terrible monsters wear the most ordinary faces. The evil that dwelled in that white-clapboard farmhouse wasn't supernatural. It was entirely human, born of obsession, control, and the fear of abandonment. Eleanor Sutton Blackburn never had the opportunity to pursue the new life she had been quietly planning. Her story ended within the walls of the house that had become first her prison, then her tomb. But through the preservation of records and the persistence of those who sought the truth, her final chapter was eventually written. Her remains, at least, were granted the dignity of proper burial, even if justice for her death remained forever beyond reach. What remains particularly chilling about the Blackburn case is how ordinary the circumstances were that led to such an extraordinary horror. Thomas Blackburn was not initially described as violent or unstable. Eleanor showed no obvious signs of fear or abuse visible to the community. Their marriage appeared, from the outside, to be like many others of the era. Formal perhaps, but not markedly troubled. It was the invisible currents beneath this seemingly placid surface that ultimately led to tragedy. The most detailed insights into Eleanor's perspective come from fragments of her own writing, discovered among her possessions sealed in the wall. A partially completed letter to her sister, never sent, contains this passage. I find myself counting the hours until I might escape, if only for a day. Thomas watches constantly, his eyes following me from room to room. Last night I awoke to find him standing at the foot of our bed, simply staring. When I asked what troubled him, he said only, I was making sure you were still there. I fear what may happen when he discovers my correspondence with the college in San Francisco. Several pages of what appears to be a personal diary suggest Eleanor had been planning her departure for months, carefully setting aside small amounts of money and establishing contacts who might help her establish a new life in California. The diary indicates she had intended to visit her sister in Millfield as a first step, before continuing westward. Whether Thomas discovered these plans before or after Eleanor's death remains unknown. The case of Eleanor Blackburn has become a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind respectable facades and the importance of community vigilance. In the decades following the discovery of Eleanor's remains, domestic violence awareness and intervention protocols evolved significantly, partly in response to cases like hers. Sheriff James Wilson, who led the 1963 investigation, later implemented county-wide reforms in how law enforcement responded to missing persons reports, particularly those involving married women. The Blackburn case taught us that what happens behind closed doors can be far more dangerous than what happens in public, Wilson noted in a 1967 interview. We learn to look deeper when something doesn't quite add up, even when the surface appears undisturbed. The land where the Blackburn house once stood has long since been reclaimed by nature. Oak trees and dogwoods grow where the foundation once lay. In spring, white blossoms cover the ridge that gave the area its name. To visitors unaware of the history, it appears as nothing more than a particularly beautiful stretch of Appalachian woodland. But for those who know the story, the beauty is tinged with melancholy, a reminder of Eleanor Blackburn, whose dreams of escape were cut short, and whose spirit, some say, still lingers among the dogwood trees, finally free of the walls that held her. In 1968, the Oak Ridge Historical Society established a small memorial garden near the site of the former Blackburn house. A simple stone bench bears a plaque with Eleanor's name and the dates of her life. Local school teacher Helen Richards, who spearheaded the memorial project, explained its purpose. We wanted to reclaim this place from darkness. Eleanor Sutton Blackburn deserves to be remembered as more than a victim, as an artist, a woman with aspirations, someone who sought a fuller life. Her story reminds us to look beneath the surface of our neighbors' lives, to reach out when instinct tells us something isn't right. Each spring, when the dogwood trees bloom across the ridge, flowers appear on the bench. No one has ever claimed responsibility for placing them there. Some say it is Martha Sutton's descendants, honoring the aunt they never knew. Others suggest it is the collective conscience of Dogwood Ridge itself, a community still seeking absolution for its failure to protect one of its own. The Blackburn case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of how isolation, rigid social conventions, and community reluctance to interfere in private matters can create perfect conditions for tragedy. It stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most normal, most respectable, most firmly embedded in the social fabric. As for Thomas Blackburn, historical assessments have evolved over time. Initial reactions painted him simply as a monster, a calculation that provided comfortable distance for a community that had failed to recognize the danger in their midst. Later analyses, including a psychiatric case study published in 1975, suggested a more complex picture of a man whose possessiveness and control gradually evolved into pathological obsession, exacerbated by isolation and, perhaps, undiagnosed mental illness. This nuance does not excuse his actions, but helps explain how such horrors can emerge from seemingly ordinary circumstances, how the boundaries of acceptable behavior can be crossed incrementally until one arrives at the unthinkable. Eleanor and Thomas Blackburn have been gone for over a century now, their story preserved in county records, academic studies, and local memory. Their tale continues to resonate because it speaks to universal themes: the desire for freedom, the darkness of obsession, the weight of secrets, and the terrible consequences when community vigilance fails. For those who visit Dogwood Ridge today, there is little visible evidence of the tragedy that unfolded there. The village has grown into a small town, with paved roads replacing the dirt tracks of 1910. The church on Miller's Hill still stands, though now surrounded by newer buildings. The creek where partial remains were discovered has been partially redirected as part of flood control measures. Only the dogwood trees remain unchanged, their white blossoms appearing each spring as they did in Eleanor's time. And in those blossoms, some say, echoes of the past can still be felt. A reminder that beneath the most tranquil surfaces, currents of darkness may flow, and that vigilance is the price of preventing history from repeating its most terrible chapters. The Blackburn case has become part of American folklore, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. It serves as a grim reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures, but ordinary people whose darkness remains hidden behind a veneer of respectability until it's too late.